So welcome to the next installment in our podcast, Focus 24/7. This is a really interesting one, so I'm really excited to be joined by Plamena Solokova. The title of the podcast is Feel the Vibe. It's about diversity and inclusion. So first of all, a bit about me. So I've been in the Workday ecosystem for 2 years now. I run a global team of Workday recruiters. And I'm going to introduce Plamena. So Plamena, tell us about your personal journey, first of all.
Thank you very much, Joe. My name is Plamena Solokova, and I am a business development manager at a diversity and inclusion consulting company called Included. I recently moved into the D&I field full-time, and prior to that, I spent 6 years in the Workday ecosystem. So I started off in the HCM space for my first year and a half. And then since 2016, I exclusively focused all of my time on Workday financials. Prior to Workday, my background was in the education field. So I worked for one of the universities in London, and I worked with disadvantaged students from across London to get them into higher education.
Oh, okay, great overview. So let's start with a really broad question, Plamena. So tell us about your take on diversity and inclusion.
So I think in the public space, there is a lot of conversations, especially in the last few years, around diversity and inclusion, or in short, D&I. And a lot of this conversation tends to focus on the first part, the D in the acronym, so diversity. And when we talk about diversity, what we really mean is the composition of your workforce. So if you're a company and you look at all of your employees, you can see how different races are represented, different ethnicities. Are there people with disabilities, different genders, sexual orientations, religions, perhaps different people from different socioeconomic statuses as well. And a lot of these that I just listed, with the exception of socioeconomic status, all the rest are actually protected characteristics under law as well in this country. But there are other things when it comes to diversity which may not be obvious when you first look at someone. And this could be, for example, where they went to university, or where they grew up, where they were born. And all of it together, with the protected characteristics, as well as the background, the story, the culture that everyone brings, all of that together really comes into the shape of cognitive diversity, meaning people with different experiences tend to solve problems more effectively in the workplace. And that's the whole goal. Get people from as many different backgrounds as you can, get as many different perspectives as you can, and your business will thrive. The second part of the acronym, the inclusion part, however, is equally as important, if not more important, than just having a diverse workforce. Sure. And really here, what we're looking at is all the practices and the policies that the organization has in place to make the employees feel included. There is various different components that feed into this, but ultimately, I think one big observation is that we should absolutely not be stopping at just diversity. We should look at how do we make our organizations also very inclusive for everyone.
Got it. Okay. No, very, very good, good opener. So tell us about the tools that are available to track diversity and monitor it.
So in the Workday space, where I spent a lot of my years recently, there is a lot that has been done in regards to D&I. In the early days, when the software was just being developed and launched, it was already possible, of course, to track some of the basic demographics. So if you're a company and you have your employee workforce, you're going to track, for example, the gender of everyone who applies or everyone who's already employed with the company. You would track their date of birth, which then in turn gives you their age, which could then give you an indication of what generation they were born in. So all of that information was already available in the early days of Workday, and you could absolutely put it into your tenant. Okay. However, as time went on, and Workday as an organization realized that D&I is absolutely an integral part of everything that they do as a business, but also the products that they develop, they also started incorporating D&I into the Workday software itself. Sure. So last year, in the second release of Workday in 2020, they released 2 specific tools that are available. The first one is called Vibe Central. So Vibe Central is basically a dashboard that gives you information about your employee data, specifically things like race, ethnicity, gender, but also looking at this through the prism of the different stages of the employee life cycle. So it breaks it down for hiring, promotions, and attrition, as an example. So you can see how many people, let's say, with disabilities get hired into the organization, how many of them get promoted, and then how many of them stay or leave the organization in a specified period of time. Workday also launched another product, again, Vibe, and this is the Vibe Index. And the Vibe Index goes one step further. It's not just looking at the data, it actually brings in external information into your Workday tenant through Prism Analytics. And by external information, what I mean is, for example, employee surveys and information that you have gathered through an external system, and you bring it in. And what Workday then does is combines that data with everything that you have in your Workday tenant, and it produces heat maps of where you should focus your attention specifically. So if you have multiple employees of a specific race, for example, that raise concerns about a specific policy or a specific benefit that it's not inclusive, and you get that through an employee survey or an engagement survey as feedback, you can then combine that with the demographic information you hold into Workday, and you can see that perhaps this is an area that we need to revisit. Otherwise, we might not be able to keep employees from that race if it's raised en masse, for example. Sure. So getting the insights is absolutely important, and Workday has really come a long way to provide that visibility and those analytics. But I do also want to say that when you have the data and when you have the right system to amend your business processes so that they become more inclusive and who you hire, who you promote, and so on, those are just some of the elements of creating an inclusive organization. And I'm really pleased to see Workday taking those steps and incorporating D&I in the product development. I can see more and more customers are now looking to actually implement Vibe, and I hope that is the case moving forward as well. And when you then take a step back and when you consider as a business, okay, so what more do I need really from here? That is where you also need to incorporate various other aspects of an inclusive organization. By that, I mean, first of all, you need to look at your business strategy and you need to make sure that it incorporates D&I. This is not talking about a D&I strategy. This is about the business strategy. Okay. So if one of your core pillars, for example, is having happy employees and maintaining very low leavers rates, as an example, what better way to do that by creating an inclusive organization, incorporating specific goals within the people pillar or the people objectives that you have defined as a business. Incorporating D&I is critical into all of your goals. You have to do it. And this is the only way that you can really ensure that it then trickles down to your business practices day to day. You then need to look at your data, which is Workday comes in, and it's very helpful because it gives you the information you need to make informed decisions. Not only do you get the information, but it can also help you set targets. And targets are really important. This is not government mandated targets. I'm talking about business specific objectives that you want to achieve. If you're in the tech industry and you have a very low percentage of women in your workforce, you may want to increase that. And you couldn't really know that without having the data in the first place. Sure. You then look at the governance model as well of your organization. That's critical because it really is all about accountability. As an example, you may choose to set up a diversity and inclusion council, for example, but is that going to sit as a completely separate organization? Or is that going to be part of the exec board? Or is that going to be part of HR? Or is this going to be a group of employees gathered together? Who is going to be in charge of them? You then may actually want to do this in more detailed setup and do employee resource groups or networks as well, where, let's say, people of color come together, or women come together, or people with disabilities, or Latinx community, and so on. And having those structures in place is crucial because they will be the ones who keep the engagement going, but also they will be the ones that escalate and that come up with the ideas and they bring them to leadership and then can help implement them.
Sure.
And speaking of leadership, actually, that's the other crucial component to it all, because we absolutely cannot have an organization to drive inclusive behaviors if the leaders at the top are not buying into D&I and they're not practicing what they preach. So leaders, absolutely crucial to be on board, but also all employees. And this applies to all levels of staff, regardless of your management level, regardless of what you do in the organization. Everyone has a role to play and should lead by example. And then finally, to really bring it all together, you do need the right systems in place. And again, kind of summing up with Workday, because if you don't have a system that helps you run your business processes efficiently and smoothly, you might not be able to identify where there are things for improvement, and especially where there is bias in recruitment, in talent management, and performance management. All of that really can have multiple areas where you may want to look into, analyze, and improve. And yes, the system, so the cloud system or the physical system that you're using is important, but you also need the expertise in-house or to speak to consultancies that work in this field to make sure that you put the right processes in place and that you debias as much as possible.
Got it. Okay, excellent stuff. Thank you very much. Great insight. So we definitely see a number of customers really interested in either taking the Vibe index or looking and sort of monitoring those metrics. So yeah, we expect a number of deployments of Vibe coming up. That's a very interesting area. Let's talk about diversity and inclusion in the technology industry. I know that's one that you know a bit about, Plamena.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a topic that's very dear to my heart. And having spent the last 6 years in a tech job, I have myself experienced what it really feels like to be a minority in the room. So not only am I a woman, but I'm also an ethnic minority. I'm also very young. I also got promoted to manager level very early on in my career. So there is a lot to kind of get through in my own head to feel that I'm being accepted in a group of people. But it's not just about how people feel individually. It's about all the practices, like I said, that are being put in place by organizations to make them more inclusive. So if we look at the tech field in the UK specifically, we have about 17 to 19% of technology jobs in the UK being held by women. Depending on which source you look at, it is certainly under 20%.
Sure.
That is a very low number. And if we look at STEM overall, which would include science, technology, engineering, and maths, the number isn't significantly higher either. It's just under 25% for the UK being women. If we maybe take one step back and we look at all of Europe, just on a bigger level, in Europe, the situation isn't significantly different because, again, you have roughly about 17, 18% of the tech workforce being female.
Okay.
There are, however, certain countries that do significantly better. And 5 of them in the European Union even exceed 50% of the STEM workforce being female.
Okay.
Yes. Cool. So I'm myself Bulgarian, and I'm really happy because Bulgaria is actually the top country in the European Union when it comes to women in engineering and science jobs. We have more than 50% of STEM jobs held by women. Other countries that are also doing very well are places like Latvia, Lithuania, and Romania. And what you can probably notice as a common thread across all of these 3 or 4 countries is that all of them are Eastern European. So there are some theories around the legacy of communism and these states and the practices that they were employing then. That has actually led to very early rise in the number of women in those fields. That is not the case in the UK, and unfortunately, not the case in the US either. So if you look there at STEM careers, it's pretty much comparable to the UK. There is roughly about a quarter of the workforce being women. So yes, it's equally bad almost everywhere with a few exceptions. And that in itself can sound very discouraging, but there is a lot that companies can do and society as a whole can do to change that trend. As one example, there is a very low number of girls that actually study STEM-related subjects at school and that go on and do this at university as a degree. So there is a common perception, and a lot of different outlets have written about this, that this is basically a man's job. And if the perception of this field remains to be predominantly male-dominated, it will be really hard to encourage women to get into that field moving forward.
Yeah.
If you just look at apprenticeships as well, that's actually another good example. 50% of all apprentices in the UK are girls, but only 8% of STEM apprenticeships are women taking those. So it's a huge, huge difference. And if we don't tap into potential, whether you've gone to university or not, whether you're doing an apprenticeship or not, you're really, really limiting the pipeline of women to actually come into this field. And then if you are lucky and if you do get some women to actually join in the organization, that's fantastic, but you also have a lot of work to do to keep them there. Role models is one way that you can do this, and promoting women and making it visible to other women that you can indeed succeed in this industry is essential. We do need to see other successful women to relate and to imagine what is actually possible for us to achieve. But we also need the practicalities to be sorted out. If you're a woman, for example, in your 20s or 30s, let's say, and you're thinking about starting a family, you will probably think twice about joining an organization depending on what their maternity package looks like or what other benefits they offer. Could it be that their medical cover also covers dependents, or it doesn't cover dependents? Under what conditions? So all of these things are crucially important to increase the number of women in this industry, but also to keep them there as well. And I think overall, if we kind of assume that everything is being done well and the benefits are in place, the practices are in place, we're still left with the important task to actually still bring women together and make them feel included and a part of a community. One good way of doing this, which a lot of organizations have really started doing in recent years, is employee resource groups or networks that are specific to, let's say, women in tech. There are various different organizations in London, in the UK as a whole, that brings women working in tech, or within specific companies as well. You can have a women's network there that brings together women across all levels, across all different job titles, and really provides a safe space for them to connect, to exchange ideas, to feedback, to kind of really empower each other. And just to kind of summarize all this, it's important to promote women, it's important to encourage them, it's important to put the spaces for them to gather, absolutely, but it's also important to have allies in the face of men, of course, because we cannot really achieve all of this on our own as women. So lots of different things have to be put in place to achieve all this, but it's not impossible and it can work, such as like we've seen in some European countries, it absolutely can work.
Yeah, okay, well, that's the absolute nirvana. So that sounds really good. So let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Let's talk about the pandemic and the impact that it's had on diversity and inclusion.
The elephant in the room, yes. So when it comes to the pandemic, obviously we're still in it to a large extent, and we're still trying to figure out what that actually means for us as individuals, for our organizations, and for us as a society. There is an increasing number of companies that have started returning to their offices now from this summer, and especially from September onwards. It seems like the 1st of September is the date for so many different organizations of what I've heard and contacts that I have spoken to. But bringing people back into the office is definitely going to look very different to what it was before the pandemic.
Sure.
And there is already certain groups of people that will most likely be suffering the most from these changes. Some of those groups are likely to be people with disabilities and women. Okay. Women as well as working parents. And I do make a distinction there because, of course, there are working fathers as well. Yep. But generally speaking, it is the women who will and have in surveys expressed most likely their desire to actually stay at home and work from home more days in the week than to do so from the office. This is to accommodate childcare and other responsibilities at home.
Sure.
But what that also means then as a result is that you, as a woman who is at home 4 days a week and you're in the office, let's say only 1 day a week, you will not be so visible. So you might not be the first in line to get promoted once the time comes for that. Men have expressed more interest and more readiness to return back into the office for more days a week, based on research and surveys that I have read about in recent weeks and months. So that is one thing to be mindful of. We also have people with disabilities as well. How will the new workplaces ensure that people with chronic health conditions, for example, are actually safe at work? COVID will still remain with us for who knows how long still. So how do we keep them safe, but also keep them included and make sure that they are a part of the working process as much as anyone else? So this is just 2 examples I'm giving there, but there is so much more to think about from organizations' management, and so much to consider of how we make our workplaces inclusive and what we need to put in place. So some things I've heard, for example, are organizations deciding to bring people in for 2 or 3 days a week and then the rest to be at home, but that decision to be made on the departmental level. And why is that important? Instead of everyone deciding on their own when to be in and when not to be in, or the company mandating it and forcing people to be there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but at home, let's say Thursday and Friday. If you make that decision in a collaborative way as a department, what you can achieve then is consistency. So everyone is at home Monday and Wednesday, everyone is in the office the rest of the week. That means every meeting that takes place on a Monday will be virtual. Yeah. No one will be in the room while others are at home. Same thing for the rest of the week. People will be held in person. So for you to ensure that there aren't some people in the room and then others at home, this is important, because as soon as the meeting is over, those people who are in the office on that day, they will gather together, they will analyze, they will reflect on the meeting, for example, and they might have more access to managers in the office that day, while those who are at home have perhaps no one to speak about and debrief with. So small things like that. How do we run meetings? How do we make sure that agendas are sent ahead of time so everyone's very clear what's expected of this meeting, what the outputs are that are being planned? You know, making sure that visibility doesn't equal automatic promotion and vice versa, penalizing people because they're not in the office and they have, let's say, caring responsibilities. All of this is crucial things that need to be kept in mind as we return back. There's lots of webinars that are currently being organized on this topic, lots of articles being written about it as well. And it's just important for people to be mindful as individuals and especially as managers and leaders.
Yeah, okay. Good stuff. So one of the areas that really intrigues me is the area of bias, and also you mentioned earlier about cognitive diversity, so diversity of thought. Let's discuss that in a bit more detail. It'd be great to get your opinion on it, and I'll share some of my thoughts as well, Plamena.
Absolutely. I think, as I mentioned earlier, in a lot of places, when we speak about diversity, the automatic assumption is that we speak about demographics and really protected characteristics of people, what their race is, or how they identify as a gender, or what their sexual orientation is, or what their religion is. But really, there is so much more that people bring to the table than just their religion or their sexual orientation or their race. They bring in all of their life experience, all the different workplaces where they worked in previously, all the different jobs that they held, the universities that they went to, the degrees that they studied within those universities. And all of these aspects together feed into and shape the person that they have become. When you have people that come with different backgrounds, with different cultures, with different experiences, you really get to benefit from a variety of perspectives. Yeah. And really, it's that different perspectives that is the cognitive diversity we were talking about earlier. It's absolutely crucial to have that in an organization because it drives up innovation. Diversity is proven to actually increase revenue for organizations in different fields. Having a diverse leadership team generally tends to lead to better performance of companies as well. And again, it definitely kind of sends the right signal to people. If I see someone who looks like me or has grown up in similar circumstances to me, I then start to believe what it is actually possible to achieve, and that maybe me too, I will also be a leader of this organization one day. So bringing everyone together, regardless of what they look like, but actually putting the focus on what they bring to the table is important. And that really does help to solve problems for the business and to help it progress further.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, from a personal perspective, I think if I'm trying to solve a problem or a challenge, really what you want is as many different opinions and as many different angles and views on how you might tackle it, and also what's actually going on. Because I think it's, you know, you don't just want to come at it from one angle. You want to be, you know, you want people to challenge you, and you want to really kind of go around the topic, kick the tires, make sure that you're coming at it with all these different solutions so that you get to the optimal one. So yeah, I totally get that. The other bit that's a bit interesting, a bit complex actually, is about bias, like I mentioned. And I feel like I understand that everybody has to have some sort of level of, whether it's normally unconscious bias. Let's talk a bit about that, because it's a fascinating topic.
Absolutely. So I think in summary, if you're human, you have bias, and that is just a given. And we all need to be aware of this, and we just need to recognize that that is just how our brains work. However, just because you have bias, it doesn't mean that you cannot overcome it and you cannot challenge yourself. And there is a lot of trainings that have taken place in various organizations around the globe on unconscious bias. And there are some mixed reviews of how successful those trainings are. So some surveys say, actually, just because you're putting your workforce through unconscious bias training doesn't mean that their behaviors will change at the end of it. Doesn't mean that there will be any actual tangible impact of this training. And especially if you make it mandatory, that can have the opposite effect. It can make people feel uncomfortable and actually not want to engage with this subject matter altogether. It's already an uncomfortable topic to begin with, let's be honest.
Sure.
So for you to face your own fears and to kind of reflect on your own behaviors, that's a challenge, and not everyone is up to it. So it's important to recognize that, yes, there is a risk in putting people through unconscious bias training. However, that being said, there is huge benefits to it as well. And various researches and surveys have shown ways to actually counterbalance the disengagement or the discomfort of people. So one good way of doing this would be by making those trainings immersive, meaning they're interactive and you are really asking people to put this in action, not just put them through an hour worth of theory of the different types of biases and what you need to do with someone, but no, give them a case study, give them a role play, put them in groups so that they work together and they discuss and reflect. Have it as a longer training as well, because research again shows that if it's longer, over several hours with space in between, with tasks in between, it does tend to make more of an impact than it would if it's just a one-off hour or 2 hour theoretical training only. So there is definitely ways to make these more impactful. And a lot of organizations are looking for those ways and they're applying them in real life. But bias, really, that's not the only training that we should be looking at realistically. You also want to look at other things. You want to look at, for example, inclusive language. Okay. And you as a leader, how should you be speaking so that everyone in the room feels heard and acknowledged? You want to also look at, for example, psychological safety. So depending on your background and depending on your history within the company, you could be experiencing a situation in a very different way than the person sitting next to you, who might be from a much more privileged position, as an example. So those kinds of additional considerations are absolutely crucial. And although D&I historically has been very heavy on the unconscious bias piece, we now have so much more to add to the conversation as well. And at least for me personally, that's one of the most exciting things about my job now, that I have moved into the D&I space, that there is so much contribution that we can make to the world, to societies, and to individual organizations. Get a better place for everyone.
Cool. Okay. Amazing stuff. So let's talk about the future then. Let's do some blue sky thinking, Plamena. What's next on the agenda? What's the future of D&I?
I think that's a very difficult question, because we can see, just looking back on the last 2-3 years, that so much has changed in the D&I landscape. If you look at the Me Too movement, for example, and the huge response that had internationally. If you look at the George Floyd murder last year and Black Lives Matter, and how much center stage this movement has taken since then, arguably very late so, but it is at least finally being discussed a lot more in public, and this conversation is now being had. So I think from a D&I perspective, really what we're looking at is to help organizations move up on their D&I journey. What I mean is, initially, a lot of organizations started at doing diversity trainings as a compliance item, or they wanted to tick a box and say X number of our workforce is women or people of color or people with disabilities or LGBT. Then a lot of organizations transitioned to using it more as a marketing tool. You would have seen so many companies put up their LinkedIn logos during the month of June in the Pride colors. Yeah. And that is great. And it's absolutely important to show support for the LGBT community. But that is not enough to be done just 1 month of the year, right? We also need to apply inclusive behaviors throughout the whole 12 months of any one given year.
Sure.
So then you kind of get to what my manager calls inclusion 3.0, which is basically really incorporating inclusion into the daily business of any organization, into the daily interactions of people, really leading by example and delivering. As any level that you're in the company, you don't need to just be a leader. Any person in the company needs to have this incorporated day-to-day in their practices. So I think the future is that, and maybe moving it to 4.0, 5.0, and all the way up, and really making this a central conversation for every single business. Because there are surveys on millennials that basically say, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was over 50% of millennials are considering D&I as a major element when they're deciding whether or not to work for a company. So that would be one of their deciding factors. And if that is the case, any business, really, the more we progress, we cannot really afford, and no one can afford to exclude D&I from the conversation. That has to be incorporated. It has to be in the strategy. There has to be buy-in from leadership. There has to be the right governance in place. And then with the right data and systems, you can achieve that.
Fantastic. Okay, well, that brings us to a close. So a big thank you to you for that amazing insight, Plamena. As we've discussed, there are some fantastic tools and systems out there like Workday, Vibe, for example, but it's really about applying this on a day-to-day basis that's going to make the big impact. So thanks again, Plamena. And I hope you all enjoyed the podcast.
Thank you so much.